Welcome to the Game Grind. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we're here to talk very briefly, hopefully very briefly, about The Last of Us Part 2, because I intend to talk about this a lot more deeply in a critical analysis, but, who knows when the hell I'm actually going to revive that. I've been saying I would for the last 5 years, and nothing has changed. But in either case, I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience with The Last of Us Part 2, having replayed it again recently with the chronological mode of the game. So if you don't know anything about The Last of Us Part 2, it's not a particularly linear game, and the remastered version got a patch in the middle of 2025 that actually reordered it to be chronological. Now, the reason why this interested me in particular is because one of my main critiques of the game, after playing it a couple of times back in late 2024 when I was going to, start producing a video about it and talk about it a little bit more in depth, was one of my major criticisms was the structure of it. That I think that there was a lot wrong with the game in its structure, both from a gameplay perspective and also from a story and just general pacing perspective as well. The game is basically structured with a prologue segment that takes place in Jackson at the very beginning of the game, and then you're in Seattle for 3 days, and you play through all 3 of those days as Ellie. Then you play through all 3 of those days again as Abby, the 2 different perspectives, all as Ellie, all as Abby, and then you have all of the stuff that comes afterwards. Now, I have my critiques with the game regarding what comes afterwards and how a lot of that basically ruins what the game is trying to achieve from a thematic perspective, for example, but that's not the purpose of today's video because that isn't addressed at all by, the chronological mode. So basically what happened was I was going to produce this new video about, really critiquing the game and critiquing it a little bit more fully and in some sense a little bit more honestly, because having actually played the game for myself a couple of times in late 2024, my opinions were shockingly quite a bit different than they were back in 2020 when I first watched a couple of playthroughs of the game. And so I had made a video back at the time on my main channel talking about that. And I didn't talk about any gameplay stuff because I hadn't actually played the game, but having watched through the story from watching others play the game a few times back at the time, I decided it was like, well, I have this opinion about the story and I don't like it, and I made a video at the time, right? So I wanted to remake a video having actually played it for myself a few years later, and like I said, my opinion was way different, but I came out of that with the opinion that the structure of it was wrong. Like, just it doesn't work. I don't think it fully I think it commits to doing the wrong thing, basically. I don't know really how else to phrase that, but basically my assertion was that if the game was more chronological, that would be inherently better for it from several perspectives. I think that the pacing of it from, playing as the 2 different characters wouldn't be as dreadful because, well, you wouldn't be playing through an entire game's worth of the story as Ellie and then having to replay through basically all of it and nearly for as long as Abby. That was a major hurdle for a lot of people, and I certainly was not super into that. And I think that instead of playing through all 3 days of Seattle as Ellie and then as Abby, I think that it would be better to do day 1 as Ellie than day 1 as Abby. Day 2, Ellie, day 2, Abby. Again, day 3 as Ellie and then day 3 as Abby. So going back and forth from the days. So I was like, thinking that this would be a slightly better structure for the main bulk of the game, both for that, gameplay pacing reason, but also because of certain writing reasons as well. There's a ton of references in between these 2 storylines that occur, certain foreshadowing and stuff that happens between the 2 storylines that I think is missed and cannot be caught onto if you're playing the game for the first time, and even for the second time, to be quite frank, depending on how long it takes you to replay it, if you ever do, because of playing through all 3 days as one character and then as the other, because by the time foreshadowing and stuff that happens in day 1 is Ellie gets kind of repeated from the other perspective, and you see that stuff from the other vantage point as Abby. All of that foreshadowing and those references and stuff are mostly missed because it's been so long since you played that as Ellie. It's been 10 to 15 hours, depending on how slow you are. If you're me, you're very slow. And it makes a lot of that material less effective, much, much less effective. And the opposite is also true. By the time you're replaying the game, unless you replay it immediately, there's a lot of references from Abby's side of the storyline that if you experience it from Ellie's side of the storyline, like say on New Game Plus or something like that, if you just replay it, that are going to be missed if you spend, any more than like a week or two in between replaying the game, because again, you have that 10 plus hours of gameplay that separates those 3 days as Abby in between that and then playing as Ellie. In fact, you actually arguably have more time between some of those references because you're playing through all 3 of those days, and then you have the end of the game, and then if you decide to replay, you also have the beginning of the game to get through again. So there's a lot of like the little subtleties of the writing that are just straight up mishandled or ineffective because of the way that it's structured. And if you instead were to play the game as day one, each character, and then day two, and then day three, like that, a lot of these different references are going to be a lot easier to catch, and they're going to mean more, and you're going to notice some of the subtleties of the writing a little bit more readily if you're looking for them, because, well, you're actually going to see those in a relative back-to-back manner, as opposed to like 15 hours later, however long it takes you to get through 15 hours of the game. And so like that's just a lot better in my opinion. So all of this like groundwork of how I felt about the game when I played it, a year and a half plus ago, I was curious what the chronological mode would do. I was going to produce this video, and then Naughty Dog out of nowhere drops the patch for the remaster version that is the chronological mode. I'm just like, well, okay, cool. Now I have to play the game a third time on chronological mode to see if I was right. Would a chronological playthrough be better for the story of the game? And the answer to that question is actually a little bit more complicated than it was going to be, because I was not thinking very well when I was anticipating like what the chronological mode would do. Like I wasn't, I guess, anticipating what this would do, even though it obviously makes perfect sense. The chronological mode of The Last of Us Part 2 reorders literally everything into the exact chronology, or as exact as it can possibly be. So that's not just reordering the Seattle days from each character, you're reordering every chapter within each day, and you're even cutting some cutscenes intermixed between some of those chapters in ways that would otherwise be a little bit strange. While I was live streaming the game on this very channel over the last couple of months, I found that there were a couple spots where I was basically tricked by which chapter was coming next, where I thought that the wiki might have had the order of the chapters wrong, because there was a cutscene from the other character's storyline that was cut in between a couple of the chapters of the other character, in ways that like tricked me into thinking that it was going to be a different chapter coming next. So that happened a couple times, for example. There's also the fact that all of the flashbacks and everything, all at the very beginning of the game, which, chronological, absolutely, I understand why that is the case. That is what makes sense. That is what chronological means. However, for some reason, I didn't think that was going to be the case, because, in my critique of the game, or my anticipated critique of the game, I was going to say a more chronological playthrough would be better. But that would involve not changing the order of stuff at the end, and would not involve changing the order of stuff in the prologue, and it certainly would not have included taking out the flashbacks and stuff from the game and putting them all at the beginning. I didn't even, for whatever reason, that possibility did not cross my mind at all, because I think that those flashbacks are actually very, very necessary for story pacing purposes within those characters' storylines throughout Seattle. So that was something that actually bothered me about the chronological mode. So I don't think that works very well, just having all of the flashbacks way back at the beginning of the game. It means that it takes way too long to get into the bulk of the game. Instead of having a 2-hour prologue with all of the Jackson stuff, you end up having 4 hours before you actually get to Seattle. And that's just frankly too much, too long. So that's a critique of the actual chronological mode that I have, is that I don't think the flashbacks should have been included there. I think that the flashbacks should have stayed where they were relative to the rest of the game, and I think that would have been better. So I'm going to basically keep that point intact from my other critique. But more than that, the other thing, like I said, that happens is, instead of just changing the Seattle days, so that you're playing one day as one character and then the other, you're actually cutting all of those chapters in between each other. So you have a chapter or two that you play as Ellie, and then a chapter or two that you play as Abby. Although the balance is actually a lot more off than I kind of expected it to be. I think I closed my tab that showed all of this, so I can't like tell you specifically what happens. But like Seattle Day 1 is predominantly Ellie for the most part. You technically have day 1, and then you have like dusk of day 1, and so day 1 is very, very long in the first place. It's easily the longest part of the game. But so you have like a couple chapters as Ellie, like one as Abby, and then you have like 6 or 7 chapters in a row as Ellie, and then you have the dusk chapters as Abby. So like the balance of stuff is surprisingly off, even when you're intermixing these chapters with each other, that I think it would have just been better to play as one character and then the other at that point, because the intermixing just works in weird ways, and because the timeline is so, in order between both characters at the same time, I ironically also feel like somehow the irony of what I'm saying here, despite my critique from earlier, is that again, some of the subtleties of the writing are a little bit missed, because now they're no longer subtle. You're no longer, being reminded of the thing from the other storyline that you played a couple of hours ago or a few hours ago. You're being reminded of that thing that just happened like 15 minutes ago in some cases. And that's also slightly less effective than I think it ought to be. And that's basically the experience of Seattle as a whole. The other issue is that like day 2 of Seattle, for example, is almost entirely Abby, and there's only like 2 Ellie chapters in day 2. Those are pretty long chapters, mind you, but they're only a couple of chapters, and that's not fantastic for, again, the pacing reason. So you're playing as a ton of Ellie in day 1, and then you're playing only Abby at day 1 dusk, and then day 2 is almost entirely Abby just straight up. So like there's just a lot about like the structure and the pacing of a lot of the gameplay and the story and the chapter order that doesn't fully work for me in the chronological mode. I do think it's slightly better than playing all 3 days as one character and then the next character, but I don't think the chronological mode is as good as I was hoping it would be, actually. I found myself thinking that it was a little bit too much. There was too much handling. There too much reordering. And maybe that's just because I'm biased to my opinion of, you should restructure it, but not tamper with it too much, I guess. But maybe it's just the fact that I think that they did tamper with it too much. I'm not 100% certain, but I do think that the ordering is a little bit tampered with too much, I guess, is basically the point that I'm trying to make. So basically, to kind of make a conclusion, I guess, to this video, does the chronological mode of The Last of Us Part 2 fix the game's problems? Well, it's a tiny bit, but not actually that much. Definitely not as much as I would have liked, because again, I think it's just there's too much reordering. I think it is too specific, it is too chronological. Instead of being not chronological enough, it is now suddenly more chronological than it needs to be for any of its points to be effective. And that's kind of the other point as well, because can the chronological mode fix all of the game's problems? Even if you think that this is a much, much better version of the game than the original version, which I think that's honestly subject to debate. Honestly, I would find many arguments along that spectrum to be compelling. I don't know if I really have a solid one, aside from the fact that I'm not super convinced that it changes that much. Well, ironically, it changes too much, which means that the effectiveness of it doesn't change that much. But in either case, the point that I'm trying to make is, regardless of whether you think that the chronological mode is effective or not, my other major problem with the game is not even just the structure. I think that the structure is off, and while that is one of my 2 major critiques of The Last of Us Part 2, it is not the most major critique. My most major critique has to do with the ending. The whole Santa Barbara section in general is just over the top. I think that it basically subverts and thereby ruins the entire thematic point that is trying to be made. And so it's kind of hard to fix that with the chronological mode, because the chronology doesn't actually change anything about the ending. It is straight up the writing and the handling of the ending that, for me, ruins what the game is actually trying to do. When I replayed the game, when I played the game for those couple of times in late 2024, I came out of it like through the prologue, the Seattle days, and then the first chapter within the farm, which honestly really should have been the end, quite frankly. There's slight asterisk to that being the end that I can get to in another video another time. That's not the point of this video, but I got through all of that and was just like, this game really isn't actually that bad. It's definitely not nearly as bad as I thought it was at the time, and with a little bit of restructuring, could have been great even. But then I finished playing the game and got through Santa Barbara and felt miserable in a way that was like, why did I even try playing this game? And then I proceeded to do New Game Plus to get the platinum like a stupid head, and continued to feel miserable because that's what the Santa Barbara section of the game does. So again, the whole ending of the game basically ruins it for me. That's my primary critique of the game. So it's not even just the question of, does the chronological mode put into The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered fix the game? I don't think it really fixes it. It makes, it's slightly improved, I think, in some ways, but not as effective as it could have been if it was more intentionally handled rather than just straight drag and drop all of the chapters into where they fit chronologically. I think it would be better if there was, like I said, a little bit more intentionality behind how those scenes were actually ordered. But the major problem with the game isn't even the chronology. It's one of the major problems. It's the major problem of the bulk of the game, obviously. But as far as the overall package, that's not even my biggest critique. It is definitely the ending that is the problem for me. My opinion, obviously. And so the question isn't, does the chronological mode fix the game? It's, can the chronological mode fix the game? And the answer to both of those questions for me is, well, the first question is not particularly, and the answer to the second question is no. It can't really fix the game because the major problem with it that needs to be fixed is not a chronologically related problem. So yeah, that's basically my opinion on the chronological mode of The Last of Us Part 2. It was definitely interesting to replay the game with this mode and to get a little bit of that surprise from the ordering of the chapters and everything being truly entirely chronological, which again, I don't know why that caught me off guard. It shouldn't have, for obvious reasons, but it kind of did. Maybe because I was still stuck in like what my preferred order of the game would be, so that the actual order of this mode didn't fit that, and therefore caught me off guard, I guess. I'm not entirely sure what all of that was, but it was still interesting to replay this mode. If you have played the mode, depending, it doesn't even really matter whether you like the game or not. I would be curious what you think about the chronological mode compared to the original. Do you think it is better? Do you think it is worse this way? I would definitely be curious to hear about that. So if you have an opinion about that and you want to leave that in the comments below, I would definitely be interested to see what that is. But all things told, that's going to be the end of this video. Thank you for watching it if you did. Yeah, that's all I have to say on the matter. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.